Okay, so this year is Nishmas Chava plus Tzvi Ze'ev. So we were, I guess, a little. I had to do for myself, and therefore I assume everyone else has to. A little reminder of what we were up to. I think we, for whatever reason, missed a couple of weeks. Anyway, we were looking at the relationship between Peshat and deeper readings of the Passukim. For simplicity's sake, we were just looking at Peshat and Midrash. We know that the Torah is read on a multi-tiers, multi-layers. This sort of multi-tier layer was recently summarized, as in about 600 years ago, where Moshe Didion defined this as Pardes, Peshat, Remez, Drush, and Sod. As I said, even though everyone talks about Pardes as the four levels, I couldn't find an earlier source for it than that. But perhaps it was perhaps others also coined that phrase. But Torah is read on multiple levels, on the secrets of Torah level, the Sod, the Remez, the illusion level, Peshat, and Medrash. I also mentioned that we nowadays use the term Medrash for sort of Agada, for the stories of the Torah and extra details that aren't explicit in the Pshat of the Pasuk. But the truth is, in this context, when we talk about Drush or Medrash, I mean both halachic and Agadic Medrash. So whenever we read the Passukim, and on face value, the story seems like it's saying one thing, and it turns out that there's extra details to the story. Or when we read Passukim and on face value, the halacha seems to be saying something, and it turns out there's extra clauses and conditions to the story or to the halacha derived from the text. Then that would be that we're referring to as drush or medrash in our context. There's medrashe halacha along with what we call medrashim. So nowadays, often when we refer to medrashim, we mean the medrash rabbah, the tanchuma, that tells us additional stories. But there's also a whole realm of what the Gemara calls brisas, non-mishnaic sources that are structured around the Passukim of the Torah. You give extra halachic detail, the sifra, the sifri, the Torah's konim, and the like. Okay, so this is the premise of the discussion. For our purposes, I'm not really distinguishing between Agada and Halacha, whether it's story medrashim or halachic medrashim. What is the relationship between Passukim that ostensibly say one thing, and yet through the medrash, they either are also saying something else, or perhaps only saying something else. So sometimes the medrash seems almost to contradict the Peshat. In other cases, it's adding details to the Peshat. What's the relationship between the two? And to what degree is there legitimacy in learning Peshat in Passukim that differs with how Chazal understood these Passukim on the Midrashic level? So the sort of, I guess I just remind ourselves at this point of two things which I mentioned last time. The first is that it is clear, and Chazal certainly understood the Torah to be a laconic text, a text that's missing lots of information. It's not a text that can just be read and it will give you all the information you need. In some respects, all texts have that, right? All texts, in a sense, secular texts, storybooks, rely on a Torah Shel pair of sorts, even if it's just the translation of words and the letters of the ABC. So all texts, in a way, by definition, miss some information. They can't tell you everything. If you read a text, a story, a novel, it assumes quite a bit of knowledge about modern life, and it doesn't explain everything. If a character in the novel sends an email or makes a phone call, it assumes you have the Torah Shel pair of what a phone call is or what an email is. And were this novel to go back in time and a figure in the 1800s to read it, they wouldn't understand the story. Right? Were a figure in the year 3000 to read it, maybe they also wouldn't understand the story, right? If technology has changed so much, people don't even know what phones and emails are there, maybe. So every story has gaps in the information it gives you. Otherwise, the story would be infinitely long. It can't explain everything about society and the world within which it operates in order for the story to work. So, to some degree, the Torah is in that sense a normal text, that it lacks information because it's assuming certain presumptions. But specifically, Chazal assumes a deeper type of lacuna, a deeper type of extra thing. It was assumed that the Torah had a symbolism to it. It was fundamentally cryptic. I think it's been oft quoted in the Tziv that picks up on the metaphor of the Torah being a shira. The whole Torah is a song of sorts. And just like with poetry, you understand when you're reading poetry, it doesn't work in the same way as prose. And that it's even within prose, but kal v'chomer in poetry, we understand that there's symbolism that's used, there's metaphor, there's allegory. We don't expect it to. We understand it's a cryptic text that needs interpretation, and the whole beauty of poetry often is that there's more left unsaid than said, and that there's layers and depths of meaning which lie behind the text. That was Chazal's first assumption about it. The second assumption is that the Torah has a relevance to readers of all time. And therefore, by definition, again, I want to flesh out this point, that there's a lacuna, there's a hole built into it, because any text which can be speaking to someone in the 1300s and in the 21st century, by definition, needs application in a certain specific way. And Chazal assumed that the Torah will, I don't mean assumed in the sense that there's no basis for the assumption. I simply mean that it's like a premise or an axiom behind how they read Torah. I'm not discussing why they took on this axiom. I'm just saying this was the assumption, the working basis in which they went into reading the text. Third axiom of how they learn Torah is that it's consistent, that even though there's multi-layers to the Torah and multi-voices within the Torah, and the Torah can be understood shivim ponim the Torah, that there's angles and facets of how you understand it, nonetheless, Torah Hashem T'mima, Meshivas Nofesh. There's also perfection to the Torah, it works together as a unit also, and therefore each reading or pathway in the Torah has to have a certain internal coherence and consistency to it. You can't have a text that says about the same thing, that it's both Osa and Mutter, unless there's a distinction between the two cases. And we know this is a classic of halacha and Gemara learning, where it's ostensibly two similar scenarios have a different ruling in the pasuk, and out of that will emerge the Gemara, for example, that will teach us how when you look with more care at the text, you will notice that these two scenarios subtly differ, and this subtle difference is critical to halacha, to how halacha works. And then, of course, the final assumption is that the whole Torah comes from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Those were the four working bases of all drashos, and where Midrash really starts from in understanding Passukim. Sorry. No? Okay, so that's the first. Yes. Sorry. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Okay, so in a sense, it's a very fine point, and thank you for making it, because it needs to be spoken about. And maybe I should have also added this in. In a sense, the discussion around Midrash and the discussion around Torah Sheba'al Peh are what they call Venn diagrams. Right? There's an overlap, but they're not exactly the same. Midrash is a part of Torah Sheba'al Peh, but it's not the sum totality of Torah Sheba'al Peh. Number one, and number two, maybe there's aspects of, depending how you define Torah Sheba'al Peh as an oral tradition, maybe there's parts of Midrash that aren't an oral tradition. Let me just try and explain what I mean by that. So in this discussion, we're looking specifically about how to read a text. Now, aspects of how you read a text will be affected by oral tradition, such as the Aleph base, by definition, in the sense of Torah Sheba'al Peh. This was really Hillel's point in the story of the Ger, in which the Ger says to him, the potential Ger candidate says to Hillel, I want to accept the whole Torah, but to only the written Torah, not the whole Torah. And Hillel says, great, come along, I'll teach you. Aleph base Gimel. The next day he quotes the same letters, Tov, Shin, Reish, Kuf, etc. Ger says, well, 1 minute, yesterday you told me this is an Aleph, today you're telling me it's a Tov. So he says, precisely, you see, you need to rely on an oral tradition. So Hillel's point is a very important point, which is even the very building blocks of a text are built in an oral tradition. Kal v'chomer, how much more so this is true in the Torah, which is unvoweled and unparagraphed. So how you paragraph and vowel the Torah can very significantly affect the meaning. And I think I mentioned this last time when we spoke about Bereshis Bara Elokim. If you read it Bereshis Bara Elokim, which is a perfectly legitimate way of reading the words Beish Reish Aleph, and have a different meaning to Bereshis Bara Elokim. So one Torah Sheba'al Peh consists of a vast array of oral traditions. That's not really what we're talking about here in Midrash. In Midrash, we're talking about how you draw deeper meaning out of Passukim beyond the ostensible Pshat meaning. Now, why did and how did Chazal draw this deeper meaning? Was it only because of textual clues, or was it also because oral tradition? We don't always know. So, example, very famous story that's become a building block of Avraham's life story is Ur Custom, that he's brought out of the fiery furnace. Now, there's not really exactly a specific pasuk that tells us that Avraham was thrown into a fiery furnace by Nimrod and that he was miraculously saved. Where do we get this story from? So Chazal read it from a pasuk, but we're left unclear in what way they're reading it from the pasuk. So Chazal reads it from the pasuk in the sense that there is a pasuk that says, Hashem says to Avraham, I took you out, good morning, Hashem said to Avraham, I took you out from Ur Kasdim. Now, what's the translation of Ur Kasdim? What's this word Ur? It doesn't mean the city Ur, and we know there is a city Ur that was in the Kasdim, in the Chaldean region, or does it mean the furnace? Because Ur is the Hebrew word for furnace. So what's the translation of the pasuk? And where did Chazal get from the additional details of the story? There's Nimrod who threw Avraham in, and a miracle happens, and how he was miraculously saved. Now, we don't really know. We don't have a clear, there's no Gemara or Midrash that talks about where these traditions come from exactly. It's possible that they drew it all out of the Passukim, or it's possible these were family stories. I mean, at the time of Matan Torah, they were only several generations after Avraham. And many of us have family traditions that tell us about our great-great-grandparents. We may not know that much about our great-great-grandparents, but we know some instances of their lives. So it's quite possible these were family traditions passed down that people in Klal Yisrael just knew the stories or what happened. They knew extra details about Avraham's life that didn't make it into Torah itself. So these are two elements of Torah Sheba'al Peh. And then you get to the third element of Torah Sheba'al Peh, which is Shikol Hadas, weighing up. You have a scenario that the pasuk talks about. You have a somewhat similar scenario that occurs in day-to-day life, in interaction between two individuals in monetary affairs, or a food item in Hilchos Brachos, whatever it may be. And now you have to use reason to apply the halach and the Torah to this situation. And that's also part of what Chazal mean by Eilu ve'Eilu Tiflikim time. So one of the classic examples of where Chazal, in their human endeavor to understand Torah, say lo b'shamayim, he is not in the heavens, it's up to us humans to determine, is a Tano de Be'achanoi, the famous story of an oven. Now, the background to the story, we never discuss what the story is, everyone always refers to it. The background to the story basically is Hilchos Tumah and Tara, only a whole utensil, a functional utensil, can become Tomei. You have this oven which became partially dismantled and then reassembled, and the question is, does it still have its Dinei Tumah? Is it still ritually impure? Or is it Tahar? Is it ritually pure because it became dismantled and dysfunctioned in the meantime? So that comes down to a shikol hadas about how you understand things. So all of this is well beyond this is all in the circle of Torah Sheba'al Peh, which overlaps with Midrash, but isn't identical. So just to summarize, to keep this very, very simple, there certainly is an interpretive and important halachic stream, which is removed from the text, which we refer to as a pure oral tradition. Halach and Moshe Sinai, that's certainly part of Torah Sheba'al Peh. There's certainly an important interpretive part of halacha, which is human reason and application of what the Torah tells us, which is also removed from the text. That's also Torah Sheba'al Peh. But then there is one dimension of Torah Sheba'al Peh, which is the human attempt at interpreting text, which we call Midrash. Midrash itself may also consist of, or why did Chazal read Passukim in a certain way? It may be because they saw textual imperative to read it in a non-Peshat way, or it may be because they had traditions that this is the way it should be read. So you have oral Torah on the one hand, you have Midrash on the other hand, and then you have an overlap where some Midrash is clearly part of oral tradition, and other Midrash maybe is removed from oral tradition completely and is just interpretation. So did you want to tell something else? No? Okay. So that's a summary more or less where we're up to. I mean, I guess just to bring out this point, I'll remind you of a couple of an example or two that we gave last time. And this really brings out the difficulty over here, that when we read a particular interpretation of Chazal, that to us appears to be quite different to the simplest reading of the Pasuk, we always need to ask ourselves, is this indeed a non-simple reading of the Pasuk, a non-Peshat reading? Is this a Midrashic reading but not Peshuto Shel Mikra? Or is this Peshuto Shel Mikra? Is this were Chazal careful textual analysts and realized that the simplest reading is not the correct reading? And I gave us a couple of examples last time. I'll just remind you very briefly of them. Lifnei iver lo sitein michshal. In front of a blind person, do not put a stumbling block, which Chazal understand to mean don't misadvise people and don't cause people to sin by facilitating Avera, for passing non-kosher food to someone when they couldn't have access to it otherwise. Does the pasuk also mean literally don't put a stumbling block in front of a blind person? And why did Chazal extend the pasuk to metaphor? So is this a medrash? In other words, pshat is don't put a stumbling block in front of a blind person, but somehow or other they understood there's deeper layers. Maybe because they understood Torah should be read as poetry, Torah should be read on deeper levels, or maybe because they said, look, if it just means literally don't put a stumbling block in front of a blind person, we know that that's like putting a burr or a shut that's like digging a pit in the ground. Or so is this a midrashic reading, or did they think this was the only reading of the text because of some textual clue? We saw the Archaeology who said, sorry, the Kliyaka, who pointed out that the pasuk carries on, the Yoresa me'elakech ani Hashem, you should fear Hashem, which the pasuk only says with invisible sins. It never says it with visible sins. So if you go through the whole Torah, you find that whenever the pasuk, after giving an instruction, says, fear God, ani Hashem, it's referring to a sin which otherwise wouldn't be apparent to the external observer. Now, giving someone bad advice is a classic example of that, right? Someone comes to ask you advice and you have a secret agenda, because if they do that, then they'll do that, and that will impact me, so I'll advise them to do one thing. No one can ever prove you deliberately gave them bad advice. It's a hidden sin. So that would fit with Yotze and Mikra. So there may be a Peshuto clue that we were insensitive to, that we weren't sensitive to, because we didn't have enough of a sort of feel for how Passukim work, and therefore we missed it. And as I said last time, this can translate into halacha l'maisa, into practical halacha. Do I transgress the love of lifnei ve'losit and Shel if I literally put a stumbling block in front of a blind person? Very interesting question. Or is it only referring to the metaphorical reading or not? This remains a debate. We mentioned the Rambam and the Chinuch and Moshe Feinstein and the Kiyakon and the Smech and so on. So through the generations, this remains a bit of a debate. I'll mention one other example, which is more extreme than this, which I don't think I mentioned last time. I mentioned Ayin Tachat Ayin, by the way, just a reminder. I don't want to go through it again. An eye for an eye. Is the pshat in the pasuk an eye for an eye? But for some reason, Chazal took it away from that meaning. And in practical halacha, we follow medrash, not pshat. And that's how the halachic system works, that the drush reading is more significant halachically than the pshat reading. Or no, is the pshat reading an eye for an eye? Right? Could there have been a time in history, or is the Peshat reading a monetary compensation? So again, is it that the Peshat reading is an eye for an eye, but halacha follows the drush reading, which is monetary compensation? Or is it that even the Peshat reading is monetary compensation? It's simply a misunderstanding of Hebrew to think the pasuk ever meant literally an eye for an eye, the sort of so-called Lex Talonis. That remains a little unclear. Ayin Tachat Ayin, the translation of Ayin Tachat Ayin, is it an eye for an eye, or is it, as I mentioned last time, an eye in place of an eye? You replace an eye, which means monetary compensation, and there are textual clues for that latter reading. Is it possible that at some, were we to discover archaeological evidence that at some stage in Jewish history they were literally applying an eye for an eye, would we say this is against Hamasora? What do we do with it? This must have been a breakaway group. Archaeologists must have got this wrong or whatever. Or would we say, like any other area of halacha, oh, interesting, evidently it was machlokas, and evidently there were those who paskened at some stage literally an eye for an eye, and that's not the halachic conclusion that we came to, and why should we be bothered by that? That's a machlokas degeneration. How do you, if you want to translate, if you want to learn with someone, Peshuto Shel Mikra, is it a legitimate translation to translate it as an eye for an eye and say that's pshat? But in Jewish, Chazal had a different meaning, and that's how halacha works. Or is it a complete mistranslation of the pasuk? This remains debated. This remains unclear. What's the relationship between pshat and drush, and how do the two work? Sometimes, by the way, it literally gets down, and this point is if I shared this, remind me. Do you speak about Arami Oved Ovi? Okay, so this is a very, very important morale, which I think deserves mentioning, because it's a point often missed. Many of us are aware that there's an important area of study of Torah, which perhaps we learned in school a little bit and then got scared off for life, which is that of diktuk, or Jewish grammar. Right, so there's a field of Jewish grammar, which is very important when we learn Torah, when we learn Passukim, how to correctly grammatically translate the Torah. Otherwise, we'll get it wrong. What's often not fully spelt out is that Jewish grammar is a little bit speculative. It's not as ironclad as we would wish it to be. And the reason for this is because we sadly no longer have a living, or no longer had a living Lashon HaKodesh, and even the revival of Ivrit was an attempt to do so, but based on limited data. In other words, the only Lashon HaKodesh we have is the Tanakh. we don't have and didn't have a living language. If you're a Jew in the year 800, you didn't really know any native Lashon HaKodesh speakers. There were no native Lashon HaKodesh speakers. All that we had was Tanakh. Now, all grammarians work by taking the pool of data they have and drawing out principles. In other words, as English evolved, let's talk about English, generally people weren't speaking about grammatical rules. In fact, you'll often hear kids in year 11 or 12 when they first learn a foreign language like French saying, oh, French is such a complicated language, and it's such an interesting language. It's got all these grammatical forms that we don't have in English, like past, perfect and past participle and so on. And the answer is, of course we have them in English. We just don't even bother really teaching the rules of grammar in English, because as native English speakers, we intuitively know it. And we all get there's a difference between he ran, he had run, and we don't even think about these sorts of two forms of past tense consciously, because we intuitively speak it. So in the period of Tanakh, we're not aware of anyone learning grammar as a discipline. Chazal didn't give us, the Nevi'im didn't give us, we don't have a Masorah of grammar as a discipline, because people just spoke Lashon HaKodesh, it was their native tongue. Around the year 750, 800, as grammar became its own discipline, the Jewish grammarians were faced with the task of trying to draw out grammatical principles from Tanakh and understand how grammar worked based upon our tradition as to what texts mean. And they drew various principles. But at the end of the day, these principles are somewhat speculative, because we don't know that there isn't a particular, if we don't have the words, I don't know, we don't have the words choshav, thought, or shachav, lay down, or shakal, weighed. If we don't have that in the pluperfect form, the most we can do is we can speculate what it would look like based on how other similar verbs work. But we don't know for sure that's the way it was. It's just reasonable, if Hebrew is a consistent language, that this is how the form should be. And the Maharal points this out brilliantly in a discussion around the pasuk Arami Oved Avi Vayod Mitzrayim, right? Very famous pasuk, because we know it from Haggadah, which we translate as an Aramean, Lavan, wanted or wished to destroy my ancestor, my father, and that's what Haggadah says, right? Lavan Tseolamad, Ma Bikesh Lavan Harami. Lavan wanted to Lakos Hakol, he wanted to destroy everyone, because the pasuk says Arami Oved Avi, and Aramean destroyed my father. Okay. Now, there's two textual challenges to that translation. Arami Oved Avi and Aramean destroyed my father. The first is it doesn't say wanted to destroy, it said destroyed. Okay, we can live with that, right? So Lavan destroyed in the sense that he set out to destroy, even though he didn't succeed in his plot, it was foiled. It's interesting use of language. In English, we wouldn't say Lavan destroyed my father if he didn't succeed. We'd say he tried to or attempted to. But evidently, this is how Chazal understood the pasuk. He destroyed in the sense he did his full destructive force and action, but his plan was foiled. The second problem is a much more profound problem, which is that Oved doesn't mean causative. It doesn't say Ma'aved Avi or even Ibeid Avi. It says Oved, which is normally the passive form, was destroyed or was lost. And from this, you get the alternative translation, which is really, we would say, the Peshat translation, the literal translation of the pasuk of Arami Oved Avi. My father was a lost Aramean, or hence the translation, which you still see in some of the old-fashioned English translations, a wandering Aramean was my father, a lost Aramean was my father. Okay, so we have here a problem that Chazal's interpretation of the pasuk seems to be profoundly against the pshat of the pasuk, because the pasuk says Arami Oved Avi, my father was a lost Aramean, and the Chazal understands it, or destroyed Aramean, and the Chazal understands it as an Arami destroyed or tried to destroy my father. Which one is the correct translation? So ostensibly, we would think that this is an example of Midrash against Peshat, and somehow or other, for some reason or other, Chazal understood to translate the pasuk like that, midrashically, and we don't really know what to make of it. And this was discussed by the Mefarshim, and the Ibn Ezra, who was not averse, and we'll see this in a few moments, to translating Passukim against Chazal on the Peshat level. It says indeed the Peshat translation is a lost Aramean was my father. The Maharal simply points out that in a sense you're putting the cart before the horse, because how do we know that Oved isn't a causative verb? Well, the answer is because in the rules of grammar, such verbs, normally oved is the passive, was destroyed, as opposed to ibeid, which we would say means to destroy, or ma'abeid, to destroy. Do we know 100% that that's how the grammatical formulation of oved works? Only if we assume that Lashon HaKodesh has a consistent grammatical system, and that oved isn't an exception. Well, maybe oved is. Oved maybe is another family of verb, right? We used to peel and pon, the different family of verbs. Maybe oved is a family that behaves in a different grammatical structure. Do we have any hint to oved being an exception to the regular rules of grammar? Absolutely none. Other than that's how Chazal translate the Pasuk. Now, how dare we, says the Maral, jump forward and think we have better grammatical knowledge than Chazal? Maybe they had a tradition that this is the translation of the Pasuk because they understood. Maybe they knew what the grammatical form of the family of oved was, and they understood that oved means cause destruction. So there's always a speculative nature to grammar, in which the grammarians, in a sense, in Hebrew, put a bit of a fast one on us because they claim to know everything about grammar when all we have is the body of the text of the Torah. And technically speaking, any Hebrew word that doesn't appear in a grammatical form, that in a particular, if we never have a past form of a particular Hebrew word, we can't be absolutely sure what the past form of that word would look like, other than by applying by comparison, comparing it to other similar verbs, and therefore assuming that it would operate in the manner of any. There's nothing wrong with that. But is that assumption 100% right? Who knows? Maybe there's times when, in fact, we can never know really. Any word that doesn't appear in a particular grammatical form, we can but speculate what it would look like in that form. Now, this is no secret to grammarians, and there's no critique of grammarians. Some of my best friends are grammarians, but it's simply it's simply just the same in the fact that there's a limit to what we know about Lashon HaKodesh, and therefore there's always a speculative element to it. And I see this morale as a very important source of pointing out something very, very important. And whenever we look at the drashos of Chazal, a certain sense of modesty in realizing that ultimately we don't know that much about Lashon HaKodesh, sadly. Right? There's a limit to what we know about Lashon HaKodesh. The Rishonim, by the way, had the task, particularly the philosophical Rishonim, of taking Lashon HaKodesh and making it fit for modern usage, where modern usage meant the philosophy of the 900s, 1000s, 1100s. And a lot of the words that we rely on in Lashon HaKodesh were invented by the Rishonim in the sense that they took Hebrew words and they gave them new grammatical forms in order to give them use. So one of the reasons why grammar became an important discipline in the 800s, 900s, and 1000s was because there was a renewed interest in understanding how Lashon HaKodesh worked in order to apply Lashon HaKodesh to new circumstances. What were the new circumstances? One of the new circumstances was Jews engaging significantly in Arabic philosophy, which in itself was a continuation of Greek philosophy, and finding that they needed to use Lashon HaKodesh in new and original forms, and therefore they had to estimate what a grammatical form of words would look like that doesn't exist. So I'll give one example of this. The word mitziut means existence, or the state of existence, or the circumstances of existence. Now, this is not a word that exists classically in Lashon HaKodesh. In Lashon HaKodesh, we have the word Yotze, to go out, to project itself, to go out there. If you want to have the grammatical form of to be in the state of going outness, to be in the state of being found, right? A mitzia, Hashavas Aveda is about a mitzia, something that's found. To be in the state of foundness, which is what existence is, we don't really have a word for that. But by extension from other similar grammatical forms, we can coin the phrase mitziut, to be in the state of foundness, which is a good word for existence. So these words were created by the Rishonim to have a particular meaning. They did this sometimes without using Hebrew grammar. So the word teva, which we use for nature, is not really found in Tanakh in that form. What you have is tova bayom, they sunk in the sea, right? From that you had matbeah, which is a coin. Why is a coin linked to the word tova to be sunk? What would be the link? Matbeah, sorry? Coins don't float, but many things don't float because it is embossed. So a coin is embossed. So a matbeah is where something is stamped into something. And from that came the word teva, which are the rules of nature, embossed, stamped into the function of the world. So the rules of nature are somehow carved into the function of the world, and therefore you get teva, nature. The closest perhaps we have to this in Hebrew is chukos im lo brisi yom v'layla, were it not for my covenant, says Hashem, chukos shamayim v'aretz, so something. I wouldn't have created the chok of the heavens and the earth, the chukos shamayim v'aretz, the natural functioning of the heavens and the earth. The word chok is we translate as a statute, a commandment. We have mitzvahs and mishpatim, which we understand, and a chok, which we just do because we have to do it, because it's chakuk. It's lachok means to carve out. It's carved out. It's like a channel upon which the world runs. So a chok is a carved out as a rule or a spiritual channel, even though we don't understand the reasons behind it. So chukos shemayim v'aretz are the statutes of the heavens and the earth. In other words, the functioning of the world along set lines, chakuk, set lines which are carved out. Even though, the Passukim synagogues, the world runs because of the covenant that we have with our control. So teva is the first appearance and the existence of the word teva is from the era of the late Gaonim, who created this word as a way of describing nature, because nature didn't. The rules of nature, it wasn't a word that they had a classic language for in order to describe. Okay, so why am I mentioning all of this? Simply to say that that when we look at Peshat in a pasuk, we always need a certain modesty around our assumptions that we can read Passukim in an alternative manner to Chazal, because ultimately our knowledge of Lashon HaKodesh, our knowledge of the circumstances that existed at the time, can often be limited. And just to summarize or conclude this section of what I wanted to say, one model for understanding the relationship between Midrash and Peshat is that Midrash is oimek ha-Peshat, is simply the depth of Peshat, that a cautious, careful reader of text will understand why Chazal saw Midrash as simply a deeper and more profound and more careful reading of the Passukim. So one way of understanding the relationship between Midrash and Peshat is that Midrash really, if you really probed the depth of the meaning of the Passukim, you would come to the Midrashic reading as at least a legitimate reading. And this approach was particularly pushed by this school of thought that arose in the 1800s, in which there was an enormous flourishing of a renewed look, perhaps for the first time in 1,000 years, at the Midrashim of Chazal, and how they emerged from the Oimek HaPshat. That very phrase, the depth of Pshat, is one that was coined in that era, and that's the era which gave rise to the Meshech Chochmah, and the Malbim, and the Torah Tamima, and Samson Raphael Hirsch, and the Chazal Kabbalah, a whole array of beautiful Jewish commentaries, Hamek Dovad and Tziv, all of which say that when you learn Passukim of the Torah in depth, with care, with a sensitivity to language, most of the time we can see where Midrash is coming from. Don't think of Midrash as some sort of mysterious reading, but you can't always do it. But a lot of the time, when you look at the Omek Peshat, when you read Passukim with enough care, you see that Midrash is indeed a type of Peshat. It's just a more sensitive reading in the Passukim. Sorry.
So, devil's advocate.
Yes.
If you were creating a rule book, let's say you're making rules for the statutes of England, or whatever it is, you will look at all the nuances and look at all the different variables that you normally would find that would create this rule book. If HaKadosh Baruch Hu is, if he did make a rule book that he wanted us to follow, why are they? I mean, we find it, let's say, Hubble, let's go down, or shall we create man Nasser? I mean, at the end of the day, you're giving a Pischain pair by not having a clear, defined shot and saying having it going around. Because say, well, you're reading it your way. I'll keep Shabbos the way I want, because you're giving coming from a different angle, and it's rather than. I mean, the Moshe knew what he was doing. So the question I ask is, why? Why is it done that way rather than clear cut?
So this is an enormously important question. Why is the Torah such a strange work? Right? Why does it have so many gaps in it? I'm going to briefly answer your question, but instead I'm going to signpost to everything I said in my share on Torah Sheba'al Peh is an extended answer to your question. In other words, why is there Torah Shebal Peh? Why doesn't the Torah convey everything that it needs to convey? And briefly, we looked at several answers to that question. And then I then stepped back and gave what I think is, in a sense, is the totality of the question, the most profound level. We saw those that say that the purpose of Torah Shebal Peh is so that it becomes integrated into us as humans. If everything is in a book, the book has the knowledge. Hashem wants us to know it. He wants us. The true carrier of Torah is the Jewish people, is the human mind. The cost of Luchos Libecha, the Torah should be written on the tablets. Which tablets? Not the stone tablets of Aseres HaDibros, but the Luchos, the tablets of our hearts. Right, that's the true place. This is the moral in Tiferes Yisrael, Perek Samaches. That the real reason for the real location of Torah is meant to be found in the in the Jewish, amongst the Jewish people. The Ran in Megillah, in Masechet Megillah, in Yodalet or Medalef, the Ran says that the real reason for the part of the reason for Torah Shebal Peh is because it's meant to be relationship. It's meant to be Rebbe to Talmud. The depth of Torah can only be taught from a live teacher. It's not the sort of wisdom that can be transmitted from book to book. And therefore, it's worth the price, as it were, of it being orally transmitted, and there being absences and gaps in the Torah. We have the Midrash in Shemot Rabbah, which tells us that it's so that the Torah is only transmitted amongst the nation of believers. And Torah isn't accessible to the whole world. We know that significant chunks of the Torah Shebal, have been adopted by other faiths and other groups, and that's wonderful. They have some access to Hashem, which is a good thing, but the practical application of how to live mitzvahs remains the preserve of Torah Shebal Peh carried by Klal Yisrael. So says the Midrash. Then we have a series of Midrashim and the Gemara in Menachos that tells us the story of Moshe being somehow mystically transported to the back of Rabbi Kiva's Beis HaMedrash, and he hears Rabbi Kiva teaching, and he doesn't understand everything that Rabbi Kiva says. We have the Gemara in Erevin of a buskul that comes out. We have the Gemara of Tanud Be'achanoi, that lo b'shmaim he, the Torah is not in heaven. In other words, the ultimate answer to your question is because Torah is meant to be a partnership between humans and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And the truth of Torah is created. I say this with care, please don't only quote half of what I'm saying, but the truth of Torah is created as much by human beings as by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Meaning to say that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the speaker, but Hashem is infinite. And ultimately, finite beings can never hear everything the infinite one has to say. And all we can ever do is catch a glimmer of what HaKadosh Baruch Hu has to say. And what we're able to hear of what Hashem says, that is the communication that's created. We often worry what happens if Torah Shebal Peh got it wrong, right? Imagine, can we be really confident about the authenticity of the traditions? And there's many answers to that question. But on one level, the most profound answer to that question is, by definition, what we hear of Torah is what HaKadosh Baruch Hu is saying to us. In other words, when a speaker speaks, I've said this before, and I can't say this enough because I think it's so important. When I'm speaking, we think that I'm the one creating the communication. Not true. If I was speaking into a vacuum, I'd just be saying syllables, sounds. They wouldn't carry any content. It's the listeners in partnership with the speaker that creates the content. That means to say the listeners are as much creators of the content as the speaker. So here I'm speaking to people online, people here in the room. Each of you are, but by there being more of you listening, there's more communication taking place. Because each of you are hearing what I'm saying and integrating it into your own worldview, into your own way of thinking, into your own way of understanding life, your own experiences, and you're hearing slightly differently what I'm saying than what I'm saying. And not only are you hearing it slightly differently, in some respects you're hearing it better than I'm saying. In other words, there's content in what I'm saying to which I, as the speaker, am oblivious. Because I'm sharing ideas, but you hear those ideas in line with your own life's experiences and your own knowledge and your own way of thinking. And therefore, there's content that you're hearing, which I never said, or I said, but I didn't understand myself. So, and this is the unique relationship that halacha gives between the listener and the speaker. Shemaya ka'ona, as halachic impacts and so on. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but the model that Chazal had of Torah is that. Again, when I speak, there's always a danger because I'm a limited human being. I don't know that much about you. I don't have that perfect a control over the way I express ideas, and therefore it's possible for me to be misunderstood. But when HaKadosh Baruch Hu speaks, knowing how each listener hears it, assuming these are honest, competent, equipped listeners. So this isn't a claim that every person has their own ability just to interpret Torah willy-nilly however they want. But assuming a professional listener, a qualified Torah scholar, a qualified Talmid Chacham who hears the words of Hashem, what they're hearing is what Hashem communicated, because this is how they hear it in their understanding. Now, how practically do we rule? There's a principle of Achei Rabin Lahatis. Achei Rabin Lahatis isn't just democracy, follow the majority, because that's a democratic way to behave. But or even follow the majority because probably the majority got it right. It's more profound than that. It means on a communal level, on a national level, the way we have to behave is how most of Klal Yisrael hear the Torah, because we can't have every individual doing it for themselves. So there's a two-tier relationship to the words of Hashem. There's what I hear if I'm a competent Talmid Chacham, and then there's what's heard by Klal Yisrael, which is what determines the practical halachic level. And by the way, Chazal saw this as an advantage in Torah. They said, there's Chazal that say, Ilmole nitra chatucha. If had the Torah be given chatuch means cut up, means in the model that you wanted, Leonard, for it to be given. In other words, every detail of the Torah was in place. This was a Yerushalmi in Sanhedrin, Omer of Yanai. Had the Torah been given with every detail spelled out, lo nitna l'regal amida, there would be no place for us human beings to exist. In other words, the same symptom or the same restriction in Hashem's presence, which allows the existence of this physical universe and the existence of us as free-willed agents, is also, in a sense, at operation in how the Torah works. Now, I say this with care because the nature of that restriction is different with Torah than the rest of the world. So I want to overstep the boundary. But Rav Yanai says there in the Talmud Yerushalmi that the light of Torah, which in many ways burns brighter than other areas of the awareness of the presence of Hashem, but even in that, it's given in a manner in which there's still left room for us as humans to hear it. Because if it was just given chatucha, it would overwhelm us, and then there would be no place for us humans. And this is the model Chazal has of Memtes Ponim Lakan and Memtes Ponim Lakan. There's 49 facets like this, 49 facets like that, and the human job is to work out the nuances and the shades and come to a halachic conclusion. So it's a different picture of what Torah is. It's a picture in which there isn't, again, I say this with care, but to a degree, there isn't an absolute truth. Obviously, there's some meanings which are legitimate. There's Shirim Ponim Torah, there's 70 faces, there isn't 70 verse. One can say things which are ridiculous and a distortion of Torah. But as long as someone isn't Megale Ponim B'Torah Shelo Halacha, they're not revealing facets of the Torah against Halacha. There are Shirim Ponim Torah, there are multiple facets of the Torah, and our ability to hear each one of them is part of what it means to be a low-made Torah. Part of what it means to learn Torah, that we hear the different facets, and out of that, the humans who hear this Torah come to a conclusion. What does Hashem say in response to your question of why isn't Torah clear? What does he say when we humans respond, Lo b'shamayim, the Torah is not in heaven? Right, the story of, again, the tunnel to Be'achanoi, the carob tree jumps a distance, the river begins flowing uphill, the walls of the base of Midrash cave in, all trying to prove Rabbi Loza, and Chazal say, no, we don't care. A bus call comes out, a heavenly voice comes out, we don't care, Lo b'shamayim, it's not in heaven. What was Hashem saying at the time? So the Gemara carries on the story. Elio, there's a revelation from Elio, Nitzchuni bonai. My children have beaten me. Hashem said, my children have triumphed over me. They've been victorious over me. How does Hashem learn Torah? Which Torah does he learn? So again, Chazal bring. He says, Yishmael b'ni says this. Akiva b'ni says that. Each of my children. The language of Gemara, I mentioned this on Shavuos night. We're very familiar with this word in the Gemara. The Gemara says, Aliba de Rabbi Kiva, Aliba de Rabbi Shmuel, and so on, which we translate as according to Rabbi Kiva, according to Rabbi Shmuel. The literal translation is Liba, on the heart of Rabbi Kiva, on the heart of Rabbi Shmuel. So the heart of Rabbi Kiva, the Luchos Libecha, the tablets of the heart of Rabbi Kiva heard Torah like this, and the tablets of the heart of Rabbi Shmuel heard Torah like that. That's how Torah is. So we're coming to the end of our time today. Just to summarize, I suppose in model number one, in all models, Torah is laconic. I guess even without answering your question, Leonard, right? Whether we like it or not, this is the Torah we've got, right? The Torah we've got, when you look at it, is laconic. You open a Torah Shebirsav, and it's impossible to understand in and of its own basis without a careful and interpretive reading. In model number one, a different way of thinking about Midrash is its Omek HaPeshat. Really, we should think of Midrash as simply another tier of Peshat. That's one way of understanding the relationship between Midrash and Peshat. Next week, we will look at an alternative model in which we understand Midrash to be in conflict with Peshat, and therefore in that model it's legitimate for us or those who are competent who so do to give interpretive readings of Passukim different to Chazal. That doesn't change halacha, because Chazal were giving the Midrashic reading, which is the one that determines halacha, but the Peshat reading is also an important endeavor for us to embark on, because that's an alternative reading to the Passukim. Not necessarily these two schools of thought. It could be sometimes Midrash is one, sometimes the other, but for now I'm just presenting them as the different ways of looking at Midrash. In the first reading, Midrash is Omek HaPeshat. Be cautious before you think that there's an alternative Peshat to Chazal. Recognize our limitations in our knowledge of Hebrew and even Dikduk and the like. And in the second alternative that we'll look at next week, no, when it comes to the realm of Peshat, we have an open card. We can say, we can read the Passukim as we wish, as long as it's accurate and reasonable in the Passukim. We don't have to worry about this being violently in contradiction to practical halacha. And practical halacha that follows Midrash. That's the second way of understanding relationships between Peshat and Midrash. That's what we'll look at. Please go next Sunday. So, okay. Thank you. Thank you.